Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making it. I know that it's approximately 55 degrees inside this room, but that shows your commitment to be here today with us and to be listening to the important testimonies that we're going to hear today. So we're really pleased to welcome everyone in the room and also those that are following us online in the live stream to this event, Understanding and Resisting China's Transnational Repression, at the margins of the 59th session of the Human Rights Council. Just a couple of few words before giving the floor for opening remarks. This event is organized by Campaign for Uyghurs and International Service for Human Rights. And I'd like to extend in particular, my warm thank you to the colleagues from Campaign for Uyghurs for pulling out this event. They're also coming from far away. So yes, a big thank you to them. My name is Rafael Viana. I'm China Program Manager at ISHR, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we start. Of course, recalling our long-standing zero-tolerance policy for any acts of intimidation and reprisals against any of our speakers or any other civil society member in the room. And we'll have a couple of colleagues from our organizations that are going to be taking pictures. Just make sure, well, you will see them around. If you'd not like to be taking a picture of, please, of course, flag it to them. And we remind, of course, that this event is live streamed and will be available on our organization's platform for replay. So for today's event, we're going to hear a few brief opening remarks, and then I'll invite the panelists to then come on stage, if I can say, for their interventions and a Q&A, and we hope that you can then stay on for a meet and greet. We have delicious food outside, and we know that it's important to be able to feed yourselves in between sessions of the Human Rights Council and meetings at the Human Rights Council. So just to start, I'd like to first give the floor to Marcelo Daher from the OACHR that has very kindly agreed to come join us today and share a little bit more about the work of the Office of the High Commissioner when it comes to transnational repression. Marcelo.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and I already start by apologizing for the fact that I have to move for a different meeting after in the council, so I will not be able to stay for the full panel, although I would very much like to hear the results. So, I mean, why are we, from the UN Human Rights Office, putting an emphasis or considering it's crucial to address transnational repression? Why now? What aspects that we, I think, see as coming as relevant? And with that, I just have to say, we just by chance released, I'm not sure if you heard yesterday, a short briefer on the topic. But I mean, for those who followed the conversation yesterday, transnational repression is not, unfortunately, is not a new subject, because the attempts to repress voices abroad is historically present throughout history. We have, if we go back to centuries, and we'll find examples. But we may feel, as we conduct our work today, that this has increased and expanded over the last decades, maybe due to a series of factors, among them the fact that we all now live in digital spaces which are transnational. We do have also much more movement and much more than tensions that are related to those which are inside. So we've seen an increasing concern in all regions. It's not confined to just a single context. So there is a need to discuss and address protection and the space for civil society to operate, looking always beyond borders and the risks that go across that. And I see here our colleague from the Norwegian mission, who led a resolution just last session of the Human Rights Council on the topic of human rights defenders, who for the first time made reference on the repression across borders. And why that, and maybe why in that context, and jumping a bit on the conversation again, because we're discussing the elements of the impact of digital technologies in the work of civil society actors of human rights defenders. which then have to go use that space and are also attacked and affected through that space. But so I mean, what kind of scenario do we see and why do we speak about that? Of course, we see a scenario where states, but not only states, especially proxies and different actors, they conduct, they will then conduct. What kind of scenarios we see as representing the most important concerns of transnational repression? Of course, you have the issue of extraditions, renditions, and arbitrary detention, and that's a subject that human rights mechanisms have addressed over the years in several cases, including some related to communities represented here today. You have the issue of abductions, and then, as I said, because of the digital space, you have the new universes of the expanded capacity of surveillance that exists because of the digital tools. And then you have the expanded also spaces for conducting online attacks, targeting individuals and groups abroad. What we see as perhaps concerning also in terms of the legal trends that relate to this environment of constraints and risks for civil society. We do have also different attempts to reinforce legal instruments that enable this repressive acts abroad. And these, if I could mention some, of course, we have the continued concerns with counterterrorism law. We have also the adoption of different laws on foreign agents in attempts to control and increase restrictions. And we have, and also I guess because that's an area where I've been working more on, we have the issue with cybercrime or every sort of legal instrument criminalizing digital activities. That is also a very kind of common way of trying to control the space for those acting abroad, with the additional challenge of the pressure for international kind of cooperation in that, and the lack of adherence to human rights principles and standards in that cooperation increasing the threats. And we should bear in mind that very soon in October, a global convention on cybercrime will be adopted. And what are the challenges there? We do have national legislation in different contexts which already enable a lot of control over the activity in cyberspace with impact for human rights defenders. And with these additional layers of cooperation, there are risks that the speed of cooperation and then, of course, of restrictions to those operating abroad can increase if we do not work well with that regard. So, I mean, I'm not going to list all the different activities of also human rights mechanisms on the topic. Maybe I think we're familiar on the work of some of the special rapporteurs or the working group on arbitrary detention, or of course disappearance. The mechanisms working on disappearances historically have dealt with transnational repression in the past. Or of course the fact that the issue was also addressed by some of the UN Commission of Inquiries. You would find the issue being highlighted in contexts such as Belarus, Syria, Eritrea. You would have also, of course, treaty bodies, and they again, all these considerations on transnational repression, they predate even this last wave of discussion. We have issues relating to denial of passports and restrictions to movement of human rights actors from decades ago. But again, why do we see a need to act now? Again, as I was saying, is because the nature of the work of human rights defense and then the nature of the tensions clearly cross borders, and then the protection activities are not going to be effective if you're just considering the concentrated in the space of where these defenders and principles will be acting. course, we have the issue of the digital tools to monitor, harass the different communities. And so what role do we see human rights mechanisms and the human rights office and then the community play? There are different layers, I think, of work which is already happening, already being done by many of you that relate first to, of course, documenting these events in ways that we can dissect, identify the trends, and respond to them in an appropriate manner. That's the first obvious method. But there is also, I mean, the need for further sort of enhancing and investing in the protection networks and the exchange of the information between these networks becomes even higher. Of course, if before there was some assumption that moving defenders from one location to another was a protection factor, that protection factor changes a lot, gets reduced and affected by the fact that the risks are going to continue there, depending on the environment we find, the cooperation with authorities and the other risk elements, which I'm sure are entering in your assessments as you conduct your protection work. And then, of course, again, because we have, every time we enter the digital space, we enter a space that is controlled by companies, and in that case, we need to enhance and improve the cooperation and dialogue with the companies, which are managing these spaces where some of these attacks are happening, or which may be marketing tools which are being used for these attacks. And in this case, we have some very clear instruments of transnational repression, which are known, well documented. For example, the surveillance malware tools that have been marketed all around the world, these tools have been used in several cases to target journalists, offenders, domestically and abroad, and that's been well documented. And in this, for example, in this case, we do have, in the case of the Office of High Commissioner, a call for a moratorium on the sale and use of these tools, and of course, a need for companies to cooperate to provide more support to civil society actors in case that are being targeted. In the case of malware, for example, there was a small victory with a legal case taken by Meta against one of these big companies who is providing these tools that could result in big compensation that Meta said is compensate by sharing these with protection networks. Recently, in France and a couple of other states have engaged in another process on cyber protection and have announced the creation of a fund also for the support of those engaged in protection online abroad. So again, as I said, this is and will remain a very important topic for the office. It's our protection mandate, in our reporting mandate, and we count, of course, on the information that you provide, and will also, of course, to the extent we can, continue to collaborate through also our protection collaboration and our reporting mandates with the different organizations present here. Because, again, if protection activities were challenging before, they become even more challenging with this new environment where different actors, because also, sorry, that was another topic which I should have flagged, the aspect that in the process of transnational repression, different actors are engaged. Of course, it's often done through proxies, through different, so establishing accountability and the different lines that relate the acts of attacks against these human rights defenders of these communities and maybe the state or the other interested parties in that are never easy to unveil. And the only way for us to do that is, again, with systematic documentation, such as the documentation you do, the quality of that information when you brought together, it helps us to review the nature of these attacks. So again, we did this brief other activities that of course we continue to do in terms of our, again, protection mandate, and we do have a follow-up process from the Human Rights Defenders Resolution that tasks the office to conduct consultations and exploring, but that was in a broader sense, not just on transnational repression, but that's one of the topics there, the impact of technologies in the work and protection of human rights defenders, and we'll continue doing that.
The brief, I think that everybody was very pleased to see it launched on Monday, and I think it gives a lot of clarity on the scope of TNR and the it lays a really good groundwork for recommendations to states and other actors. I continue the round of opening remarks now, giving the floor to Turgun Janalaudun, who is the president of the World Uyghur Congress. Please.
Good afternoon, my dear colleagues. I am honored to be with you here today. As the president of the World Uyghur Congress, I understand transnational repression very well. Indeed, it's not just a vague concept, it's a very concrete reality that we experience, struggle with, which directly affects our lives. I have personally witnessed how the Chinese government tries to silence, intimidate and suppress is in the diaspora, not only within its own borders, but also around the world. This form of repression manifests itself through methods such as surveillance, threats, online harassment, repression against family members, and even abductions and forced deportation. For us Uyghurs, the transnational repression carried out by the Chinese government is multi-layered. In Europe, America, and the Middle East, and even in Africa, the Chinese government is following, threatening, and trying to silence Uyghur activists. Our most basic human right, the right to speak, is under threat even here, as some of us have been expelled from UN buildings and followed or arrested here in Geneva. China is holding many Uyghur families in the diaspora hostage and using them as tools against us. We are faced with threats every day, such as if you speak, your mother will die, or if you protest, your brother will go to jail. They use police stations abroad to harass and monitor their citizens. This is not just oppression, it's a form of psychological torture. When I announced I was running for the presidency of the World Uyghur Congress ahead of our 8th General Assembly last October, my siblings were threatened by the Chinese police. But here we are. The Chinese regime could not win this war because we are here. Because the truth has the power to penetrate repression. We speak the truth, and we will continue to speak. Therefore, the first step in resisting transnational repression is not to be afraid, because what authoritarian regimes like most is not to silence us, but self-censorship. The second step is to establish stronger solidarity with other allies, which is exactly what we are doing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would invite, before we invite my fellow panelists to the floor, I would like to give the floor to Tina, who is the representative of the Tibet Bureau here in Geneva. Tina, please.
Thank you, Ralph. Very good afternoon to all participants and co-panelists present here. My special regards to the members of the missions. Your presence speaks volumes about the importance that you're giving to this topic. I'm very much glad that the Office of the High Commissioner has come out with the briefing note on the transnational repression, and it is but timely that Campaign for Uyghurs and ISHR is organizing this panel to not only understand transnational repression but also to understand how we resist it. For Tibetans, it is not a new phenomenon. As my co-panelist kindly noted, that it dates for decades back, and for Tibetans, it has started since the 1950s. Since coming into exile in 1959, Tibetans have been targeted at every corner, on every table, on every cafe, in every building that is known to humankind. We have resisted, and also we have ensured that our voices are heard in the tables that are there. Our voices are echoed in the institutions that take important decisions. As a very brief example, I was with some of my fellow human rights defenders in the UN building during the UNSSR review recently. And I was photographed, we were harassed, even during the UPR review we were harassed. What is very important to note here is that it is not just about transnational repression that is happening, say, in remote border areas, or in some hotels in the cities, or in some villages. It is happening in one of the safest countries in the world, Switzerland, in one of the cities that is known for its global community, that is Geneva, and in the building that represents the protection and values of the 21st century, the United Nations building. If a human rights defender like myself is not safe in the UN building, where else can I be safe? And that is where lies the crux of the TNR. It is the countries like China and the Chinese government that is behaving with impunity, with the confidence that now, as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists have rightly termed, the UN has become its playground, and therefore they feel that they have the authority, the audacity, that they can harass human rights defenders in the UN building. Can you imagine, if it is happening in the UN building, how Tibetans must be suffering inside Tibet, where their voices are repressed, where there is no access for information, and there is no access for justice. And therefore, as I decided to keep this very brief, I would once again urge institutions and organizations like ISHR to create as much awareness as possible, and also to the missions of the member states, that it is now upon you, upon the institutions like the United Nations, to really stand up for the values that you represent. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? Until recently, I always told that yes, the Chinese government is intimidating us, threatening us, but at least they are not resorting to physical abuse, they're not killing people. And in that hope, I was still continuing my work until the recent case of Tugu Hungar Dorji, who died in custody in Vietnam after escaping from Tibet in the custody of the Chinese agents and the Vietnamese government. And now I worry is that the future that we are looking at, where Tibetans will now once again be picked up from the roadside, will be picked up from the UN buildings, and be taken to some mission's backyard, and we will never be heard again. And that is the reason why it is important that we act now, that we speak now, and we speak not just for us, but for the people, for Tibetans, the 6 million Tibetans and the 7 million Tibetans in Tibet, for the Uyghurs, for the Hong Kongers, and also for the Mongolians and the democracy-loving Chinese in China. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Tinley. And with this, I would like to thank our Marcelo, Turunjan, and Tinley for these remarks. Thank you very much for laying a little bit the context of this discussion. I would now like to invite our panelists, Rushan, Tobjor, and Amy, to join us, please. As we start this discussion a little bit more in detail, I think that these remarks were very good in terms of setting a little bit the context for understanding what is now not considered necessarily a new phenomenon that was perhaps a couple of years back, but that now is in everybody's heads when we think about the actions of the Chinese government abroad, and a phenomenon that has accompanied the growing presence and the growing adverse human rights presence of the Chinese government in UN hallways and internationally, which is the willingness and the intention to silence dissenting voices. And that has taken the form, of course, of transnational repression. And I'd actually like to thank a lot Tinley for pointing out also the intersection between transnational repression and reprisals. That is, when transnational repression relates to cooperation with the United Nations and becomes reprisals, which is a serious, of course, human rights violation that is addressed by a range of UN mechanisms. And as ISHR will also released a report recently precisely about this and exposing a little bit those tactics. But so without further ado, I'd like to first introduce our three panelists today. First, I'm going to go in the order that you're seated, although the questions are not going to necessarily go in that order. So first to introduce Amy Siu, who is a chairperson of Freedom for Hong Kong Association based in Germany, and also the General Secretary of the European Hong Kong Diaspora Alliance. Amy was born and raised in Hong Kong and has been living in Germany since 2010 and has become an activist following the 2019 mass protests in Hong Kong that I'm sure everybody's aware of. Next to Amy, we have Rushan Abbas, who's the founder and executive director of Campaign for Uyghurs, and also the chair of the World Uyghur Congress Executive Committee. So Rushan is a very well-known leading Uyghur activist in the US since 1989, receiving, of course, numerous awards for her outstanding work, and who also rose to prominence following China's wrongful detention of her sister, Dr. Rushan Abbas, who is, of course, a case that we hold very dear to our heart here in Geneva. And next to Rushan is Tobjor Toltrim, Communications Director at Students for Free Tibet, where he leads the media strategy and the engagement with the UN mechanisms here in Geneva. Tobjor is a native of New York, has joined SFT in 2023, and is currently a JD candidate at Columbia Law School.
Remarks of this important issue on this important issue. As an Uyghur, transnational repression changed my entire life in the last 7 years. Yes, I was advocating for my people, but only at the side while I was working full-time as a successful international business person and with a successful career. But when this mass detention started in 2017, by summer, 24 of my family, my husband's family members disappeared. My parents-in-law, all of my husband's siblings and their spouses, and 14 of his nieces and nephews. As an American citizen, I exercise my freedom of speech. I participated in a panel like this in September 2018 at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., speaking about China's long crimes and atrocities against Uyghur people ever since the occupation and the mass detention, and as well as outlining the fate of my in-laws. 6 days after, as Rafael mentioned, they took my sister, a retired medical doctor. Because I spoke, because I exercised my freedom of speech. Now, since September 2018, she's in jail. A non-political, just ordinary person living her early retirement life due to the health reasons. Now, she is in jail in China's fabricated charges, so-called related to terrorism. She's sentenced for 20 years. We are all being targeted, as our President John mentioned earlier. Because of our advocacy, because we spoke out, we are being intimidated, death threats, and the reputational attacks. Recently, I just published my memoir last month. Since then, when the book came available on Amazon, there's another book just showed up, a creation with AI-created book in my name, Rushan Abbas, and the claiming that telling my sisters and my story in reality just to distract the readers. And also, after years of being targeted by the Chinese Communist regime with their official media like China Global Times Network, Xinhua News, calling me CIA and all kinds of names, which started with Jolly Juan's first public tweet. And now they are changing the tactics because it didn't work. Detention of my sister didn't work. Detention of reputational damages did not work. I quit my full-time job and became a full-time actress last 6-7 years. When I did that today, now they are trying to take a coordinated reputational attack against me. They just created last few weeks a WhatsApp group, and they're saying that exposing corruption. Well, we take those attacks. We try to amplify our message even stronger, and I take all this as a badge of honor because we need to speak up. The CCP is afraid of the most is us speaking of the truth because they want to push everything under the rug and they go through the millions and billions of dollars of campaign of disinformation, and we're trying to whitewash the genocide and mass detention, but we are going to continue. Because more attacks we see, more tactics we see, we look at that as what we are saying is really getting under their skin, and because we are exposing what they are doing against our people.
Thank you, Rushan, and I think that in your testimony, it's really very often we talk about TNR, digital transnational repression, but we don't understand the scope and the diversity of the kinds of actions that can be taken. I think it's pretty clear also from what you shared. A lot of them seek to decredibilize you. Some of them, of course, may seek to intimidate, but very often it seeks to decredibilize you in the eyes of others. I'd like now to turn to Amy, if you could share a little bit more from your experience from the Hong Kong perspective, which acts of TNR have targeted the Hong Kong community abroad, and what are, of course, your personal experiences? And I'm particularly interested if you see any turning point in this process over the past few years.
Thank you very much first to Campaign for Uyghurs and SHR for inviting me to this platform. So we Hong Kongers, we really appreciate every opportunity to be able to say something. So thank you to all of you also today to hear what I have to say. The Hong Kong experience to TNR is quite different. So we said a few times today already, it's not a new phenomenon, it's existed for decades already. But we Hong Kongers really started to experience this maybe 5 or 6 years ago only. So 2019 was the first mass protests in Hong Kong. And in response, the Chinese regime really weaponized laws as the primary weapon to go against us Hong Kongers, and from that to do TNR. So to be more concrete, 2019 were the mass protests, and 2020 was the passing of the, was the imposition of the national security law. And I really meant in quotes because the Chinese regime drafted this law in secret. Announced one day suddenly that, hey, Hong Kong, you're going to take this law now. Completely overriding the parliament and legislature in Hong Kong and completely ignoring the promise for autonomy and so on. This is a separate topic for a different time, but you know, suddenly in Hong Kong we got this law, and it's really ridiculous. This law can be applied retroactively. This law applies to every crime occurring anywhere on the planet. So this is a law that works for everything. And in fact, it has already been applied to people for crimes committed in the past. So this was the first step in this weaponization of laws. The second step came only last year, March 2024. This time, the Hong Kong Parliament itself passed another law, the so-called Article 23. Officially, is the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance. So this is a stronger version, if you may, of the national security law, having more details about what crimes are chargeable and what concurrent punishment comes after. Even very recently, just last month, there was a supplemental regulations also passed in the Hong Kong legislature to expand the role of official name as Office for Safeguarding National Security. This is a fancy name for secret police. So with all these three laws, the Chinese regime as well as the Hong Kong government can again go globally without impunity to persecute Hong Kongers doing activism work, defending freedom and democracy, defending human rights. Maybe I start now and this was the turning point, 2019, and the laws. That was the turning point for Hong Kong. And maybe I start now with a bit of a personal experience. I am very, very lucky. I am based in Germany, and so far what I have experienced is I was physically followed, and I was stalked online. I made police reports. Unfortunately, the perpetrator was not captured at that time. This is very, very mild compared to somehow other Hong Kongers have experienced across the world. So I don't have time to go through many things, but let me just tell you a few things that happened very recently. Last year, March, a human rights defender, her name is Carmen Lau. She's based in the UK. She works for a human rights organization, and somebody organized wanted letters, posters, and posted them to ordinators in her neighborhood. Of course, this also implied that the Chinese regime knows where she lives. Next month, April this year, we have a human rights defender. His name is Joe Tay, now based in Canada. He is participating in local elections in Canada. And the Chinese regime did two things. First, an online smear campaign, primarily on social media. But the Chinese regime also manipulated search engines, so that when you want to search information about Joe Tay, you get some unsavory information. Then the next month, May 2025, last month in the US, this time Anna Kwok, her father and her brother were helping her in Hong Kong to collect some financial documents. And this is the very, very first time that the family member of a Hong Kong activist not only intimidated, but actually arrested, charged, held, without bail. So this is just a sample of what's happening to Hong Kongers now. Starting from a few years ago, nothing really happened. The thought of political prisoner is just so foreign to us. To just a few years later, we're facing the entire spectrum of TNR. And we recognize here that unfortunately, the state actor here is the Chinese regime, and they are the expert, one of the experts of TNR of our world. And we have listened to our Uyghur communities, our Tibetan communities. We are really very fearful because what happened to them throughout the decades, we see the same tactics apply to us now. And in fact, in such such a quick succession. So we really have every reason to believe that the TNR applied to us Hong Kongers will only get worse and very fast. Maybe as a last remark, let me just tell you what kind of people the Chinese regime is targeting. It's really just everybody or anybody who doesn't like what they say. We're talking about former legislators, journalists, academics, social workers, student leaders, even singers, pop singers, really just anybody. We have currently 19 individuals who have a cash bounty on their heads, each of them over 100,000 euros or Swiss francs. We're speaking about serious TNR here. We're new to the phenomenon, but we are true victims as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you again for laying out how the national security legal framework in Hong Kong has really been weaponized and applied extraterritorially, and for highlighting those recent cases. Carmen Lau's testimony was featured in the OACHR launch event on Monday that I think some of you have joined. I'd now like to pass on to Dr. from a Tibetan perspective. Your organization, Students for Free Tibet, released a joint report with the Hong Kong Democracy Council precisely on the issue of transnational repression, and you've contributed personally to this to a few of the investigative pieces too on this. So how can you share from your findings and your experience a little bit how this affected the Tibetan community, and in particular the role of embassies and of government-aligned student associations in condoning or abetting or complicity in those acts?
Thank you, Rap. Thank you everyone for coming and braving the heat. As you can tell, Tibetans were meant to live inside Tibet, not in exile. So thank you so much for everyone who joined us here today. To answer this question, I'll start first looking at the question of tactics, the question of methods. I think as Tajikla opened, my family, when they came, they were born as refugees in India, when they first came to America, my father has been bringing me, my parents have been bringing me to protest since, I could fit inside the pocket of my father's Tibetan robes. And it's a lived experience for Tibetans since then. Since we arrived in exile, parents have been bundling their children and wrapping their faces in scarves and face masks and sunglasses long before COVID-19 was a thing. Because they knew that if their children were ever photographed at a protest carrying a sign that said Free Tibet or carrying a portrait of the Dalai Lama, that would forever forfeit any chance of them being able to return home to Tibet and see the rest of their family. This is a lived experience that's deeply ingrained in Tibetan people. And over the past few years, myself and my peers have been so thankful that the international community has now come up with a vocabulary, a vernacular to deal with this particular issue. Because again, like I want to underscore, it's a lived experience that's deeply ingrained in how we exist outside of Tibet here in exile. In terms of these methods, first and foremost, we have intimidation. It's been well documented in the ISI, International Social for International Investigative Journalists report, the report that my organization, SFT, co-wrote with the Hong Kong Democracy Council, seeing how individuals who we believe are affiliated with or working in conjunction with the Chinese state will photograph, will follow. When we were here at the CESCR hearing, the treaty review in 2023, we had an individual come up to myself, LC, next to a Tibetan monk who was a former political prisoner from inside Tibet, who had since escaped. And he went straight up to his face and was taking photos of his face, and I held my bag in front of the man's camera, and he would try to move around. Exile, escaped to Vietnam, where he had a group of Vietnamese supporters, and yet the Vietnamese police, working in conjunction with the Chinese state agents, kidnapped him, and one day later, March 29, 2025, he wound up dead. completely overnight. There was no prior health conditions that were reported. That's a case of extreme violence. On a more macro level, to speak to now the role of embassies and the role of student organizations. In San Francisco in 2023, in the fall, Xi Jinping came to visit for the APEC summit, and myself and many other activists were on the ground. And we have now, protests, you had a group from University of California, Berkeley, carrying their Chinese Scholars Student Association's banner proudly. And when we went to videotape them, they smiled and flipped the middle finger at us. It is proud involvement in this. And we had screenshots from the CSSA group chats from these universities that friends leaked to us, where they received directions saying, meet here in front of the quad, in the lawn. Buses will be provided, housing will be provided, meals will be provided, and all you have to do is show up and be mobilized as this rent-a-crowd for these to be counter-protesters. And the last instance I'll draw on is we had a protest at Harvard last year, where the Chinese ambassador to America was invited by the Chinese Scholars Student Association at Harvard to give a speech. And we had Tibetans and Taiwanese activists counter-protest inside this event. And one of these protesters was dragged out by a Chinese international student who was not deputized in any manner to serve as a security role, yet physically, with his hand, laid violence upon her and dragged her out. And instead of prosecuting this crime of assault, Harvard University issued them an apology when the U.S. Special Select Committee on Competition with China subpoenaed these internal communications from Harvard. They found that a Harvard official had apologized to this international student for all of the drama and news fanfare that this had caused, all the speculation about his identity and all that. He said, we're so sorry for all the negative press you've been getting, and we hope to see you at graduation. So I think this is how we talk about, we have embassies, the Chinese embassy, it was proven, the Washington Post investigation found that there were embassy staff on the ground in San Francisco who were helping coordinate the counter-protests against us while Xi Jinping was there. So it's irrefutable. It is, out there to be seen. And thank you so much, Rob, for the opportunity to share with everyone here.
Thank you so much, Dr. And again, I think that your emphasis on the APEC summit was really key. It was really, I think, a turning point for a lot of us, and the report that you published really was contributed in that sense. Also in understanding this, the whole ecosystem of proxies that act under the effective control of the government, including student associations, but also, here in Geneva, you were mentioning a little bit before, not only, of course, the embassies, but also government-organized NGOs or gongos. I'd like to turn back to you now, Rushan, and now looking a little bit more forward, and how can we think, based on these lived experiences, about concrete recommendations. So, and of course, beyond the significant impact this has on individuals and communities, this also poses a question of the security of individuals residing inside countries. And the obligations that states have towards this. So what policy measures would you recommend for governments to better protect their citizens in the end? And what role should the UN play in addressing this threat? And I think that a lot of it connects, of course, to the OHCHR's initial recommendations in that regard.
Thank you. Just sitting here listening to our fellow advocates here talking about what kind of threats and tactics they are facing, we all share the same thing. So the CCP is playing, working out of the same playbook. So it is extremely important to raise awareness, building in institutional capacity and the interagency communications among each other. And the states, countries should share the information and they should work together. And threats and harassments must be investigated seriously, taken seriously, and the transnational repression should be labeled as international crimes against humanity. I know we are running out of time, so I'm just going to make it very quick and just give a couple of quick recommendations. We need to have accountability. from the Western countries especially, because we are not just the Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kongers, we are not just the diaspora communities, we are the citizens of each country. So we need our governments to make sure that there is accountability against those threats, and the social media companies, cyber security firms, and the legal systems, system providers must be required to conduct human rights due diligence, and everybody should be held accountable. And lastly, since we are here in Geneva, I strongly urge the UN to create a dedicated mechanism or appoint a special rapporteur who focuses specifically on the transnational repression. Because this is not just something just coming out right now. This is what we have been facing for decades, for all our lives. We just didn't name it transnational repression. It's just a new name given recently, but we have been being targeted, we have been being victim of transnational repression for years. So we need to have some sort of accountability system in the US, in the States, and the countries should introduce legislation to hold the CCP accountable for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there was a couple of interesting recommendations in the report by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression last year. She released a report on the safety of journalists in exile. And she tackles TNR pretty extensively, and in one of the recommendations she precisely says not only that putting emphasis on identifying and prosecuting individuals that committed TNR, but also revising and modifying legal frameworks precisely to understand the scope of TNR, in particular when those acts don't amount to criminal acts under national law, but still, auto response. I'll turn to Amy now. So if you could share a little bit more on what do you see as the role of NGOs and international coalitions in responding to TNR, and what are also specific recommendations that you have also to address TNR for the Hong Kong community? I think that there's going to be a lot of commonalities among the communities, but sometimes there may be some specificities that you also see.
Yeah, thank you for the questions, Raphael. Maybe first to your question about the role of NGOs in this whole TNR phenomenon. Let me answer from a more German point of view. I'm coming from Germany, and I'm very proud to say my organization, Freedom for Hong Kong, we are part of the Transnational Repression Coalition in Germany. We have in this coalition NGOs representing Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, Tibetans, also Belarus, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Egypt, Vietnam, and so on. So we are a very broad coalition, and I can report here two very important wins. You might know that earlier this year, Germany had a big federal election, and we now have a new government, or we had a new government very recently. And for the very, very first time, in the negotiation for forming this new government, TNR was named as part of a topic to even address. I know this was only one sentence in the whole document of a few 20, 30 pages, but even being mentioned, our problem is being recognized, and this is really thanks to the advocacy effort of this coalition of NGOs. And also because of the efforts of the NGO, we successfully campaigned for the federal government to have a central person or coordination person from the Ministry of Interior. So for the very first time, there is actual person to go to if you have a question or suggestion. Before that, it was you talk to you. No, we made a difference. And I know this is a start, but this is a big and important start. So to answer the second question now about what can we do in terms of recommendations, many points have been said already. I don't want to repeat, only to emphasize that the briefing that Raphael pointed out earlier with the piece of paper, I find it very good. There are four main topics of recommendations. I can say very confidently, all of them are very good, but just to emphasize, training is important. And for me, again, I speak more of a German point of view. We're talking about your local police and various law enforcement authorities. What happens when I face TNR? I go to my local police station. Sure, the police person is very sympathetic, very professional, took my statement and so on, but there is not much awareness that something bigger is in play, that this is something very serious, although the person was only following me on the street and taking my picture and putting it on social media. It's a much worse thing than you first think, and this can only come from training and especially your local law enforcement agencies. And again, accountability, this I also want to emphasize. especially when we come to the spectrum of TNR tactics from the Chinese regime. A lot of them is fairly subtle. Sure, they intimidate some family members back in Hong Kong, well, it happened somewhere else. Sure, they're just intimidating you, they didn't hit you, and so on. So many of these crimes, they are crimes, but our legislation has to be updated or refined so that they really can be prosecuted as crimes and again, be labeled properly as TNR. So without accountability, the same thing will only go on. So my final comment is that TNR by nature is a cross-border phenomenon. The perpetrators, the actual actors, coming to intimidate you, to follow me, and so on, they're also very mobile. Today, or one day, that person was in Berlin, in Germany, the next day he was in the Netherlands, and so on. The whole accountability issue must be addressed from a cross-country coordination perspective. Otherwise, we have already lost from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, in particular on this last point, and that makes a little bit, let's say, the novelty of this issue and how to tackle it. And for the last but not least, Dr., a very similar question to you, just based on your documentation that you outlined before on TNR. What are practical measures that are recommended to governments, but also to multilateral institutions like the UN, to better identify and counter those threats?
Certainly. And I'll give two here. The first one is on a very basic level, to understand the issue and the nuance of it. Right? We always say, when we had TNR happen to us, when we were attacked in San Francisco, we went to a briefing. There's a photo of one of my colleagues at one of this briefing with like a bruise on her face because she'd just been hit with a water bottle at the protest a few days prior. But yet, we still went to the briefing and had to explain this issue from the ground up while like physically nursing injuries. So while we are here in a room like this, when we're able to discuss academically, systematically, understand the nature, the nuance of TNR, for example, what activities are deemed sensitive, what communities are at risk, and what are these risks at play. So you can be proactive. And what that goes to, as Amy mentioned, coordinating a law enforcement response. When we were in San Francisco, the FBI was looped in some regard, but the local police had no clue what was going on. And if governments are able to be proactive and coordinate a law enforcement response when these things happen, it takes the burden off of the afflicted communities in many ways. And the most important, or a very important one that I'll end with, is to the governments. A key role is ensure you are not being co-opted. Recently, when Xi Jinping came to Paris, came to Europe for this tour, a Tibetan woman in Paris just saw the motorcade going by, the barricades were there, and there were hundreds of Chinese people waving flags. And she had just gotten inspired. She had come out of lunch, or come out of her job, had her lunch bag, like a white tote bag like this, and just scribbled with Sharpie, "Free Tibet" on it, and stood up. Wasn't even doing anything else. And the police came over to her and took her and her Tibetan friend and held them in a police van and took her to a French jail for hours that day. She was standing with a tote bag with the word "Free Tibet" on it. I think it's an example of how in that instance, I don't know what level that discussion occurred, but the French police was being co-opted by the Chinese government to serve their ends, right? These Chinese people could be out there waving flags and utilizing whatever speech they wanted, but even holding a tote bag with the message "Free Tibet" on it was deemed illegal in that instance by the French police. So not being co-opted, as these governments around the world continue to engage with the Chinese government, to not be co-opted into their TNR schemes.
Thank you so much, Dr. We're running a little bit late, but I still wanted to make sure that I could open the floor perhaps just for any brief remarks or any questions that you'd have. We also will have a meeting with you right after if you want to also engage more privately, but just making sure if anyone would like to have any interventions from the floor, please raise your hand. Yes, so I see two. I'm going to take those two questions. If there's any third question, perhaps. Okay. And please identify yourself too.
Thank you. I'm Hani Shah from the EP Switzerland NGO. I'm active since 3 years. So my question is it's a general question. Just to know, how do you consider, those financial constraints that the UN is facing, and especially the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, and what is the impact on your activities or the activities, in general, of the human rights, issues and upholding, the human rights? And you can, of course, refer to your the situation of Uyghur or Tibetans or Hong Kong? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate all the speeches and the ones before. In fact, my question, and I feel ashamed, what we didn't know about what's happening with the before 2014, and can we consider this as a genocide situation, the same like Israel is doing in Palestine, or not? Have you been, very far with the legal, let's say, instruments in order to have some recognition? Because I'm a lawyer and I want to understand. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I would like to start.
I'm going to answer the question.
Sure. We'll maybe need a wrap up after this, so if you have any final concluding remarks, you can integrate it into this.
Okay, I'll go ahead very quickly, just to tell you, because many people don't know the details of what's happening to the Uyghur people. Every single day, Communist China took over entire China in 1949. The Uyghurs were subject to persecution during the 50s. Uyghurs were labeled as under the nationalists. 60s, Cultural Revolution. Uyghurs were labeled under the counter-revolutionists. And then 80s, 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Uyghurs all of a sudden became separatists. And then after 9/11 tragedy, the Uyghurs became terrorists because they are Muslim. Fast forward to 2014. Xi Jinping became in power in 2012. Then 2013, he announced Belt and Road Initiative in Astana, Kazakhstan. His Belt and Road Initiative is a blueprint for the global domination. And 4 important legs come out of our region, our homeland. And therefore, his policy is either make all the Uyghurs as Han Chinese, speak Chinese, believe yourself, forsake your national identity, ethnic identity, and your religious identity. If you become a Han Chinese, we allow you to live. Otherwise, everybody is subject to eradication or detention. Every single aspect of the religion is being criminalized. The reason that we say it's genocide, which is confirmed by more than 12 countries around the world, and including the US and the first Trump administration, and then last administration, and then again, Secretary Rubio confirmed twice recently it's genocide, because the Uyghur women are subject to forced sterilization. Over 1 million Uyghur children are taken from their families, sent to state-run orphanages and boarding schools. Uyghur birth rate dropped down to 0% in the mostly Uyghur populated areas. And the Chinese government is not even hiding that. They publicly celebrated those genocidal efforts on their official tweet. The Chinese Embassy in the United States said that with implementation of the reproductive health or policies, the Uyghur women are no longer baby-making machines. This is the actual quote. So yes, it's genocide, and the people don't know because of all the obvious reasons we are talking about. If we speak, our family members are taken. If we speak, we are being targeted and attacked. Every single Uyghur in diaspora, our family members are at the Chinese government's hands, being taken as hostages. Our neck is being held, actually. We are doing our advocacy today at the cost of our loved ones' freedom back home. So please speak up, because crimes like this, genocide and crimes against humanity and everything we will start speaking, silence is not acceptable. Because this is not just staying within China's borders, it's coming at us no matter where we are. So if we don't speak out today, then the only voice left will be one of regret. So I'm done with my closing remarks.
Thank you, Rushan. Amy, maybe?
Sure. Let me continue this thread of thought. I said earlier when it was my turn to speak that the tactics of the Chinese regime has been perfected over the decades and applied and tested on the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. For us Hong Kongers, we really fear the same of what Rushan just said is going to happen to us. In fact, I worry that my family in Hong Kong is going to be affected. I don't want to worry my parents, so I don't ask them, but I very indirectly and subtly try to talk nobody's following them, if they're harassed. This is my weekly reality that I have to sort of watch out for my family from afar. So for us, this is real. The point of erasing cultural identity, it is absolutely happening in Hong Kong as well. Children in Hong Kong schools, they are encouraged or forced to speak Mandarin and try to abandon your local Cantonese heritage. So again, my same message that whatever worked there and there, it is absolutely applied to us. And so we want to also speak out and make sure that this is not going to happen to us in the future. Now addressing your question about funding just very briefly, yes, it does have impacts. And I'm speaking now from the role of a member in an NGO. We Hong Kongers in Europe, the Alliance of Hong Kong Diaspora, we actually had plans to work on, in fact, right on the topic TNR on Hong Kongers in Europe. And we had plans, we got a proposal all settled. Unfortunately, based on funding limitations, this plan had to be scrapped for now. There are real impacts. I mean, yes, we do this work as volunteers, but it does cost some money at the end of the day. That is unfortunately the reality as well. Maybe my very final remark, I realize that we have representatives from different missions here. From me, also, thank you for coming, thank you for listening. This is a real problem for us. It means actual personal impact to our lives. Thank you for giving us your attention.
Thank you so much, Amy and Dr.
I'll say, growing up, my parents banned me from participating in Model UN, the club we have in America, because the United Nations for many Tibetans ceased to represent hope for many, many Tibetans. They failed to take action when Tibet was being invaded, and their track record over the past few decades has been dismal for in the eyes of many Tibetans. Nevertheless, we continue to engage, continue to provide information, and be here at the UN. And in this funding crisis, if China continues to step up and fill that vacuum and line the UN's coffers with China's money, does that then erode the trust, the little hard-fought trust that Tibetans have tried to build in the United Nations? The Office of High Commissioner has, so far on China, and specifically on Tibet, struck a disposition of diplomatic silence, relative silence. If China continues to fund the United Nations, are they then able to choose which mandates, which procedures get funding and which get cut, which treaty bodies to fund? If they will, for example, go before the Child Rights Review, which they have over a year overdue. If those things happen, then the UN truly is, as ICIJ accuses, become China's playground. And then will truly have ceased to represent hope for the Tibetan people.
Thank you, Dr. I'll try to end in a little bit of a positive note, because I think, again, that one of the main topics that were raised today was the issue of awareness, right? And that's one of the reasons that we're here today. Dealing with the new issue that is